So, once again, the topic of who the next James Bond will be has entered the news sphere. Nothing solid yet, but people are talking about potential new actors who could be playing James Bond. The thing that's been grabbing headlines is that the producers basically made a statement. They said that for the next James Bond, whiteness is not a given. So I think the real question is, will we get kind of a reimagination of Bond as somebody who he hasn't been in the past? There has been a lot of talk recently about making James Bond female, which I think is ridiculous for many reasons. But the other question is, well, maybe James Bond should be played by an African American actor, or a an African English actor, and I think that's an interesting question because he's still being played by a man, but he's culturally and racially a little bit different, and so yeah, that's kind of entered the conversation.
And I find it very interesting because it distills down, I think, a very important question, which is, what is James Bond? Like, and maybe even larger than that, like, what are our characters? Like, are they the maybe character traits that they have? Are they their identity? Are they their skin color? Are they their ethnic background? Like, certainly Harry Potter would be a different series of films if he came from an Indian household, right? We can recognize that there is a difference between a British culture and an Indian culture or an Asian culture or an American culture. And that sometimes it is central to these characters that they come from this culture. And I think James Bond in particular is British culture. With that, I think that we also have to accept that there has been significant demographic change within Britain. And in a lot of these areas, African, British people, as you said, it's odd that there's not quite a term like people are. You're African American if you're here in America, but you're just African, or maybe you're just potentially English, right? And so I think if James Bond's core is being English, I don't know that the color of his skin matters as much as his solidly being English is, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I generally agree with you. The reason why I think... So first off, I think it's clear, regardless of what you think about, a potential kind of dramatic cast change for James Bond, I think it's clear that the motivation for doing something like that would be kind of political virtue signaling on the part of the filmmakers. So I think that that's something that is obvious. With that said, I'd be much more open to having a black man play James Bond that really fits the role. Like, a lot of fans have been talking about Idris Elba potentially taking over. I think Idris Elba would be a great pick for that role. But I think if they cast a woman, it fundamentally changes the dynamic, because I think the core of James Bond is that he is, for better or worse, male wish fulfillment, and he is kind of stereotypically English. He represents England. So I think as long as those core elements can be maintained, we'll be doing okay. However, I don't like the trend of trying to reimagine iconic characters that are iconic for...
But Ben, is not the idea of James Bond as he exists in filmography the constant reimagination of him? Like, isn't that
To
the
a
point,
point.
that we constantly get a new actor? He's not, been one person where like we're just race bending him, which there is an element of here, right? That you're doing some race bending. But the nature of James Bond is that he evolves to sort of reflect the modern Britain as it continues on. So particularly if we're doing a modern James Bond, I don't know. I don't know about this one.
Well, here's the thing. Let's think about the trajectory that James Bond casting has taken over time. You got your first James Bond. You got Sean Connery. Very self-confident, very self-satisfied, very charismatic, a little bit cartoony in a way. But he knows what he is, and he doesn't apologize for it, and he represents what he represents. Fast forward even to Daniel Craig. Daniel Craig really was the postmodern James Bond. It's much more grounded. He deals with really challenging emotions like loss and self-doubt. They do a little bit of gender flipping in the Daniel Craig ones, where, in James Bond, you so frequently have the attractive woman being highlighted, and there's a scene in the first Casino Royale with Daniel Craig where they're kind of objectifying Daniel Craig kind of as a kind of flip of the tables. So I think if you follow that trajectory, and given the context that I said before, that kind of the motivation of these studios is to kind of subvert expectations and cater to radical demands, whether or not the thing in and of itself is good or bad. That's kind of the motivation behind it. I think to cast a black actor as James Bond is not necessarily a bad decision, but I think taking the motivation into account, you kind of see this trajectory where they're really trying to like invert or subvert what he is and what he represents to the fans.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it would mean a great deal for what England sees being English as like, right?
Yes, and in conclusion, there's one more point I'd like to drive home. Mm-hmm. We do need. I keep wanting to say African American. we do need black heroes for black audiences. I think it is the one thing I'll concede to the left is I do think, when you have a significant population of people that are just not, they don't have anybody to look up to, they don't have any positive role models, I think that is really damaging. So I do think that we should have black heroes and black positive role models in media. So I think those characters and those franchises should be created. So I am wholeheartedly in favor of them creating like a secret agent character or something similar with a black lead. I think my concern is more with changing what people know and love in a way that seems motivated by political desires.
I think you've hit the nail right on the head, that the motivation behind this, and particularly the tone with which it's done, if this is a film that goes on to sort of flaunt, how he's not quite as British, how he's different, how he, then that to me is sort of getting more at the core of the character, and really, what makes James Bond James Bond.